Hey, just kidding. I don't wear glasses. What's up? I saw that had about 9 views on the last video. There's 20 in the class. Pretty sad. Anyways, keep on going. Anyways, we're winding to a close here. So we will be finishing up this chapter this week, having another test, and then finishing out the year. How crazy is that? But let's get back into it. So we were talking about Reconstruction. Where we left off, we were talking about the South's kind of response to Reconstruction. We were talking about how the groups like the League of the South and the Ku Klux Klan kind of swoop in to defend themselves against carpetbaggers. So they call them. I mean, I don't want to say defend themselves, but in their minds, defend themselves against carpetbaggers and these newly freed blacks that were attempting to gain the right to vote and exercise their newly gotten rights. So yeah, I finished up. There's a dog howling. Anyways, so where we left off talking about the Klan, right? These really, really scary, really creepy pictures early on of the Klan in the 1800s. Now, when we talk about the Klan, people tend to think of the Klan that was the new Klan, or the Klan that was founded in the 1920s. But actually, it was founded right after the Civil War, and they tended to look like more like this. These pictures are scary, but it started in Tennessee. One of the original founders of the Klan was reportedly the next Confederate general by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Whether or not how much he was involved in that group, we don't really know, but we do know he had some involvement with the group and was pretty adamant about killing carpetbaggers and trying to regain status, or regain the status quo as it was before the Civil War. So the Freedmen's Bureau, though, that's an organization that we kind of briefly mentioned on. It's an organization that was established to combat this giant problem that was in the South. The problem was you have all these refugees, you have all these freed blacks that now have nowhere to go, nothing to do, no food, no education. And then you have all these veterans, and again, you have these refugees. So you have this massive problem. The South has been destroyed. There's no infrastructure. There's no money. There's no crops. There's no food. There's no anything. And this is a organization started by the government to try and fix some of the problems that were going on in the South at the time. Now, their number one problem, the problem that was probably the largest problem in the South at the time, is what eventually it took its name from, which is the freed men. Those other two things, like I said, Veterans Affairs and refugees, those problems kind of fell by the wayside to this group, and their number one concern became the freed African Americans after the war. So 1865, U.S. government steps in. It's called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau becomes the name that everybody kind of latches on to, because the majority of people working in this organization too are only really interested in helping out the freed African Americans. There were people that joined in to do those other things, but by and large, the largest group of people that joined in to do this or wanted to help out is because they wanted to help out those freed slaves. So the things they did were issued clothing, fuel, food, other supplied to freed slaves, homeless people, helpless people, again, white people and black people, and deal with the issues of the post-war South. Now, there were, obviously this was about giving aid to the white Southerners who lived there, who had had their houses destroyed, and soldiers that were returning home didn't have anything. But at first, the Bureau focused on helping poor whites, but it soon became more about helping the black, especially black men, function as free men in society. Things like securing voting rights for black people, property rights for black people, helping them to vote, register to vote, teaching them how to read and write. Many free blacks, they were afraid of being treated poorly by their former owners, or treated poorly in general. They had no idea of business. They had no idea of how to draw up a contract, or how to get paid fairly, or what even a fair wage would be. Massive problem of not really knowing, because they had never had any education in terms of how business works, or how the economy works, or how really even money works. Slaves were kept on a plantation, usually one place their whole life, and they just knew how to work. Many of them were skilled workers. They knew how to do certain trades and tasks that other people didn't know how to do at the time, or at least there wasn't many of. Like something like a blacksmith, you probably had a disproportionate amount of former slaves that were blacksmiths, but they didn't have the knowledge of how to go out and make money, or how that all works, how that whole system works. So they didn't know how to read or write most of the time. Remember, it was illegal for slaves to read and write. And one of the focuses of this bureau was to teach black people how to develop work contracts, earn fair wages, read and write, register to vote, all that kind of stuff. Northern missionaries came south and helped them to establish schools so they can learn stuff, especially the younger people, and also churches. You start seeing a rise in things like the AME churches that we talked about in the last chapter. AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal. It's an attempt by the Northern Methodist churches to start Black Methodist churches in the South. You also have the same thing, Northern Baptists coming down and starting Baptist churches in the South. Prior to this, you really didn't have a whole lot of churches that were just for, slaves. Slaves, they didn't have churches. They had religious services usually on the farm, on the plantation, but that was even limited as well. Training for pastors began. That's also something that, there were not many Black pastors. There were people who maybe were more spiritual leaders on the plantation, but there weren't any trained pastors. There wasn't anybody that was specifically a pastor very often in the Black community. So many Southern whites resented this aid because they saw it as the Northerners only helping out those people, the free Blacks, and not helping themselves. So it's almost like in their mind, it's that they don't care about the sufferings of the white people. It's like they feel betrayed, and they already have a sour taste in their mouth because they've been defeated and they have nothing, and everything's been taken from them, everything's been destroyed, and then they see these Northerners coming out helping out their former slaves to help them be successful, and in their eyes it's this idea that they're going to overtake them, and the Northerners just want them to have everything. And so there's this resentment, there's this anger, there's this fear. Again, that word that we've used before, status quo, right? The idea of just keeping things the way that they are, the way, have you ever heard people be like, oh, that's just the way it always is. It's the way it's always been, right? That's the idea of status quo. And that's very much the way that the South wants things to return to, the status quo, the way that it was, the way that it's always been. And that means the same people being in charge and the same people who are kind of left out and marginalized, remaining left out and marginalized. So, but Lincoln, so everybody knows, and you guys read already through this a little bit in the assigned readings. I hope you read it. Let's be real though. If you're watching this video, you probably did, because if you didn't, you're probably not watching this video. You probably just said, I'm not going to watch that. So maybe you're one of the 9 people watching this. So stay tuned to the end then. There's extra credit. By the way, I offered extra credit in the last one at the end, and one person apparently watched the video the entire way through, because only one person saw that I offered extra credit in the video last week. That means one person actually watched the entire video. Pretty sad. So anyways, Lincoln, probably the best ally for the South after the war, ironically, was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln wanted the country to come back together. He thought it was the priority. He thought it was the number one thing for the country to heal. He did not want to punish the South. He did not want to somehow, make mass arrests or, not let anybody vote who fought in the Civil War for the rest of their lives, or try and put some laws on the South to make them suffer. He wanted the country to come back together as quickly as possible, and he was probably the South's number one advocate or ally going into Reconstruction. And it was his plan. Reconstruction was his plan. And he thought that the South and the North must be reunited and healed together. He did not believe the South should be punished. He wanted a quick Reconstruction. He didn't want a long, drawn-out thing. But many Northerners, and we're going to call them radicals, the radicals wanted the South to pay. They wanted not only financially to pay, like me, like he wanted them to give them their money, but also he wanted them to pay in terms of like, he wanted them to accept like blame. They wanted them to kind of like grovel and beg for forgiveness and not let former Confederates vote anymore and not let them have their property and not let them do this and not let them do that. They wanted the South to have a long, difficult Reconstruction and really make them suffer. So Lincoln's plan was to have an acting governor. Only 10% of the state's voters had to take a vote take an oath of allegiance, meaning that they would take this thing that said, I take an oath that I'm not going to rebel anymore against the United States, that I'm sorry for fighting in the Civil War. If you had 10% of that, if you had 10% of the voting population do that, they could elect delegates, and those delegates could write up a new constitution for the state. As well as a new constitution, they had to repeal secession, they had to outlaw slavery, and they had to cancel all war debts. So all the debts for all the war, all the money that was owed to everybody was just like, all right, it's just gone. We're just going to magically make it just poof, it's gone. If they did all those things, like you see right there, they would be readmitted to the Union. They would be forgiven, and that's not really asking a whole lot. So in terms of what's going to be asked of Reconstruction, what's going to be asked of the South, this is a very good way out for the South. This is what they're going to want. The South doesn't know it because they're going to, quote unquote, bite the hand that feeds them. Have you ever heard that? Weird noises. Yeah, bite the hand that feeds, meaning that they're going to fight the Union at every turn. And part of this is going to start with the assassination, spoiler alert, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So unfortunately, Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction is not going to happen. 6 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln is assassinated by a guy named John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He does not actually fight in the Civil War, but he is adamantly against Lincoln, and he believes he's going to be this great vindicator for the South, this great avenger for the honor of the South. So he and some others come up with this conspiracy theory. This conspiracy, it is not a theory, it's a conspiracy. They come up with a conspiracy, and they are going to kill Abraham Lincoln. They're going to kill the vice president, whose name is Andrew Johnson, and they're going to kill the Secretary of State, which is a guy named William Seward. All three of these men are the chain of command. So if those three guys die, the country will be thrown into a panic, into chaos. The order of succession of who would become president next would be unclear, and the idea was that they would just create complete chaos, and everything would kind of fall apart, and then maybe it would be an opportunity for the South to somehow still squeeze some independence or victory out of this whole thing. So he does this in the theater. Abraham Lincoln likes to go to the theater. I must not start that yet, but he likes to go to the theater. He goes to a comedy. The comedy is called My American Cousin, or Our American Cousin. And Lincoln wants to kind of release. The war's over 6 days after Lee's surrender. Technically, the war's not completely over because there's still little pockets of people fighting here and there. But for the most part, the war is over, and Lincoln is kind of finally at a place where he can kind of relax. And he wants to let his guard down. He goes to a comedy. It's like going to a movie today if you're going to go watch a funny movie. So he goes to a funny play, and he's in the presidential booth. He's sitting there. He does not have a large security detail. Presidents back then did not. No president had been assassinated prior to this. Lincoln is the first U.S. president to be killed while he's in office. By the way, there's four presidents that have been assassinated, by the way, if you want extra credit. Find those four guys, email them to me. But there's your extra credit. The first American president to be assassinated is Abraham Lincoln. He has a sentinel, a guard that's kind of near him. There's another guy who's an army officer that's sitting next to him. John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He knows the place where Lincoln is. Goes into the box, has a small pistol, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, jumps onto the stage, breaks his leg when he does it, jumps onto the stage, holds a pistol up in the air and says, there's kind of a conflicting thing about what he said. He said, some people say that he said the state motto of Virginia, which is Sic Semper Tyrannis. That's Latin for this, thus be unto tyrants. This is what happens to tyrants, is what he's saying. And then some people in the crowd say that he said the South is avenged. It's possible he said both of those things. We don't really know. But after that, he goes off the stage and he flees for his life. Several days later, he is caught up with in a barn, and he and his fellow conspirator is shot in the barn. The barn's lit on fire. He comes out, he's shot up. He dies there. The other two guys that were supposed to go kill the vice president and the secretary of state, they one of them, the guy who's supposed to kill Andrew Johnson, he gets drunk and he does not end up doing it. He chickens out. So he leaves where he's supposed to go. He doesn't go kill the vice president. He chickens out, and again, he had too much to drink or something, so he leaves. The other guy who's supposed to go kill William Seward goes up into William Seward's house. He actually gets in, and he gets into the bedroom where William Seward is laying down. He's very, very sick. He has a disease. I think he's got measles or mumps or something like that. The guy gets in, he gets on top of him, starts stabbing him wildly. William Seward's moving, ducking. He's sick, but and his daughters are in there. His daughters are trying to stop all this. This guy, his pistol misfires. They end up wrestling him kind of off, and the guy ends up running away. William Seward lives, even though he's been stabbed a bunch of times. He ends up living. Fun story about William Seward, by the way. William Seward actually spent some time in Eatonton, if you can believe that. His first job was as a teacher here in Eatonton, Georgia. He was in love with a young woman who was from here. He moved here to be close to her and possibly get engaged to her. The relationship did not work out. He said, "The heck with this." He left Putnam County. He went to Washington. He became a big deal and ended up being the Secretary of State. He's the guy who is responsible for buying Alaska. So fun facts about that. There you go, Eatonton playing a role in U.S. history, sort of, I guess, or not. I don't know. So anyways, his vice president now, this is where it all gets really sticky and weird and crazy, and it's really unfortunate for the South and for especially the people of the South that are, disenfranchised there. You've got this guy, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, becomes president, something that no one really expected to happen, no one really wanted to happen. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was from the South. He was from Tennessee. He's the only senator that did not leave Congress when the South seceded. So when all the other Southerners left to go fight in the war, when all the other Southerners left to go join the Confederacy, Andrew Johnson did not. He stayed in Washington. He stayed with the Union, even though his state left. He's the only person that didn't. Because of this, the Southerners see him as a traitor. He is the ultimate traitor to the Southerners. They hate his guts. Now, the Northerners, on the other hand, do not trust him because he's from the South, right? He's from the South. He's going to go easy on these Southerners. Now, his plan that he's going to carry out is going to be Lincoln's plan, essentially. But Lincoln's plan is a graceful plan, but it's Lincoln. So it's different when it's coming from him. When Andrew Johnson brings out this plan that's very, very, in the South, it is seen by the Northerners as him simply going easy on the South because he's from the South. These radicals, like we've said, are not going to be held back by Lincoln's political genius. Lincoln's great politician. Andrew Johnson, not as eloquent, not as smooth as Lincoln ever was. Oh, it's the only time that I can think of where a president who was a Republican ran with his vice president being a Democrat. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but because he's the only Southerner who did not leave the South. Abraham Lincoln wanted to bring him in as kind of a unifying force. Lincoln thought that he would help him unify or work with the South because he was a Democrat, because he was from the South, and most of the Southerners, Southerners were Democrats back then, and so he saw this as an opportunity to try and to help bring the South back into the fold. Unfortunately, though, Lincoln didn't see himself being assassinated, which put Andrew Johnson now in charge of the United States. By the way, Johnson grew up as a indentured servant. He was basically, not a slave, but as close as you could get to being a slave as a white person. He had a really rough life. He had a really rough time growing up, and he eventually became president. So rags to riches story, but he is one of our most tragic presidents because everyone hated him. He was universally hated by everyone at the time. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union. Like I said, only Southerner not to give up a seat in Congress. He was disliked by the North and the South. He is considered to be the most unpopular president of all time. He's considered to be the worst president of all time. It's not necessarily a product of anything that he specifically did, but more the fact that he was not able to get anything accomplished. Both the Southerners, the Northerners, the Republicans, the Democrats, everyone universally despised this guy. And again, it's more just because of the situation that he found himself in. Northerners felt like he was too soft on the South. Southerners saw him as a traitor, which they would have called a scalawag. That was one of your words that you needed. A Southerner who works with the Northerners, a Southerner who co-conspires or helps out the enemy. The ultimate traitor word in the South was scalawag. President Johnson, he appointed a guy named James Johnson from Columbus, who was a Unionist, meaning that he was loyal to the Union, to be the acting governor of Georgia. And who knows, maybe he just chose him because he liked his last name. I don't know, probably not though. It's probably because he was a Unionist, probably because he was pro-Union, even though he's from Georgia. A new constitution was drafted by Georgia. The government began acting very similar to the way it did before the Civil War. And this became kind of a problem to many Northerners. They're like, wait a minute, what did we even fight this war for? Everything's just going back immediately right back to normal. They were even voting on the same guys who served in Congress before the war to come right back, and during the war, to come right back and be in the government after the war as if nothing happened. So many worked to establish laws that limited or stripped the rights of Black people immediately. That was like some of the first legislation that they came up with, is that they attempt to create legislation, bills, laws, all this stuff to try and reclaim those rights away from African Americans that had recently just been freed from slavery, and try and put them back into some type of form of bondage or servitude or a lower class. Obviously, they couldn't put them back into slavery because slavery had been decidedly kaput, put away, it's done. But they tried to come up with new ways in order to still limit the rights and the freedoms of those people. Here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln getting shot in the back of the head, right there. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, didn't fit on the bed because he was really tall. Everybody knows that about Abraham Lincoln. He was tall, so they had to lay him like kind of catty corner on the bed. He died there. You can visit both those places. Ford Theater is very small. Abraham Lincoln's son, weird story. So Abraham Lincoln's son obviously was president after his father was assassinated. He was very, very close with his father, and his father like loved him, doted on him. But he was there for his father's assassination, and then he was also present for two more presidential assassinations. Now, obviously, he didn't live long enough to see the fourth one, but he was president for three presidential assassinations. He was in the same building as all three of them. How crazy is that? Just serendipity. But anyways, there he is. Very sad. Here is what happened to the conspirators. They were tried and they were hanged. People were very upset about when you killed a beloved figure like the president. And these people were immediately, very swiftly punished. And one of them, as you can see, this was very controversial. One of them was a woman. This is her name was Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt was the mother of one of the conspirators, one of the leading conspirators. And because of her proximity to the meetings, they decided that she knew what was going on. She knew about this conspiracy to kill the president, and that she was therefore guilty just as much as the others were. So she was hanged. It was very, very rare back then for women to be hanged or put to death, or even a lot of times put in jail. And there's a movie about this if you want to watch it. It's called The Conspirators. It's very, very good. It's about the trials of these people. It's got a really good cast too. Look it up. Here he is, Andrew Johnson, worst president in U.S. history, as they say. I don't know. You can make up your own decision on whether you think he was or not, but it's pretty widely held. He was president for 3 years. And they tried to get him out of office. He was the first president to be impeached. He was not removed from office. He was saved from being removed by like 2 votes. And he pretty much just rode out the rest of the time in office, just trying to, I guess, lie low. He couldn't get anything done because, everybody blocked what he tried to do. And then he also tried to block a lot of what Congress was trying to do. So there was this push and pull and this fight between Congress and him. And obviously they all despised him, and he despised them, and the South also despised him, but the North despised him. So it was a rough go for old Andy Johnson. But he was buried in an American flag wrapped around him on a pillow that was that had the Constitution written on it or something like that. So he had this very strong sense of duty and loyalty to his country and to the Constitution and all that. So he was the president at one point. So let's talk about these amendments. These amendments are very, very important. Speaking of the Constitution, this is the last thing for this video. So the amendments to the Constitution are something that's going to be pushed through to Congress in this. So after the war, Republicans in Congress passed 3 new amendments to the Constitution. It's the fastest amendments that are pushed through. It's because Congress is basically completely held by Republicans. They don't really have a lot of fighting to do with the Democrats, because the Democrats aren't there yet, right? They all went with the South for the most part, and so you've got a Republican-controlled Congress, and they're able to pass a lot of these things. So the 13th Amendment, you need to know this: 13th Amendment outlaws slavery, 1865. So slavery is done, 1865. The 14th Amendment is the Civil Rights Amendment. No government shall make any laws limiting the rights of other citizens. It's equal protection under the law. All people. This happens 1866 to 1868. The government cannot take your rights away. The government's job is to uphold your rights, all people's rights. And this includes all people born in the United States. Anyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. The 15th Amendment, the right to vote shall not be denied due to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The reason why they had to make this amendment very, very clear, black voting rights, is because the other ones possibly could have created voting rights for black people. It was almost understood that this should, but the problem is that the southern states began to go around those. So let's say, for example, civil rights. The government can't make any laws limiting the rights and restrictions of its citizens. Well, then the southern states would come in and say, well, but we're going to say you can't vote if your grandfather never voted. Well, that's not a fair one, because that means that the slaves obviously would not ever be able to vote, because if your grandchildren now cannot vote because you could not vote, and you can't vote because your grandfather couldn't vote because he was a slave. So, they come up with these different laws, and yes, that was a real one about being a grandfather. They also came up with these different ones, like if you were, obviously the obvious ones are if you're black, or if you're an African. If you were once a slave, you can't vote. These were laws that they actually did come up with, and they seem ridiculous. And they're like, really, that's not even fair. Like, that's ridiculous. But that is the way that it was. So they had to come up with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment said it doesn't matter. All men can vote. Now, again, this does not allow women the right to vote. That doesn't come along until much later. About what? I don't know how many years. anyways, each way later, each amendment was passed due to the South's repeated refusal to let blacks have equal rights to vote. So they had to keep, the South keeps trying to go around them with these laws. They'll come up with a law and says, you gotta let the black people vote. They're like, yeah, we'll let the black people vote, but they can't vote if their grandfather didn't vote, or they can't vote if they can't read, or they can't vote if they don't own property. And then they're like, then they say, oh, well, you're not allowed to own property. Or they'd say, like, you can't vote if you've been arrested. And then they just go around and arrest all of them. And they say, oh, there you go. Can't vote if you've been arrested. Well, you've been arrested, so now you can't vote. These were real things that they did to try and prevent black people from voting after the war. And this lasted, by the way, all the way 100 years after the Civil War. This didn't just end. Slavery doesn't just end with the Civil War. The idea of official slavery, chattel slavery, that ends with the Civil War. But from 1865 all the way until like 1970, the civil rights of black people in the United States is completely restricted, and they're not able to exercise those rights that they should have been granted in 1865. They're not able to actually get that until the civil rights era in the 1960s. They created these things called black codes, which are a lot like the slave codes we talked about before the war. There were laws that all black people had to follow. They were called Jim Crow laws. They made black people basically second-class citizens. This angered the Northerners and caused a lot of radical Republicans to take over Reconstruction. Johnson was impeached by Congress. He was saved from being removed from office by just a few votes. And this really is where it gets ugly. And a lot of Northerners, they're exhausted from the war. They're exhausted from all this stuff. And they're really not willing to put in all the time and effort in fighting the South after the war is over this idea of Reconstruction, over this idea of racial equality. Many of the Northerners said, look, we fought this war. It's over. It's done after all this time. And they're just, their energy and their heart is not in it. It just doesn't matter enough for them. And that's very, very sad that for so many people, for millions of people in the South, African Americans in the South, their rights are going to be basically allowed to be taken away from them for the next 100 years. And it's mostly because the people lost the will to keep fighting for it in the North. They lost the desire to keep going because it was just too tiring. It was just too much. It was too taxing. And you could also say that, there was enough of racial stigma in the North. The Northerners were not, all perfect, abolitionists and racial believers in racial equality either. So, there is a good amount of Northern racial racism, I guess, for lack of better words, we can call it racism. I mean, that's what it is. So unfortunately, for the next 100 years after the Civil War ends, these freed blacks have a very nominal existence. And it's going to be we call it the Jim Crow era. And we'll talk about that in the next video. But anyways, we'll stop there for today. Have a great rest of your day. Oh, one more thing. If you watched all this video, I want you to email me the word banana. All right. See you later. And yeah, have a great one.